The sea was calm that morning, the sky painted soft blue with streaks of early sunlight. Carlos, a fisherman in his early 50s, was alone in his small wooden boat just off the Florida coast. He had been fishing these waters for over 20 years. He knew every curve of the shoreline and every usual fishing spot. But today, he had gone a little farther than normal. He followed a feeling, maybe luck, maybe instinct. He didn't know why, but something told him to go deeper into the sea. His boat rocked gently as he lowered his net into the water. It was a simple task, one he had done hundreds of times before. The engine hummed softly behind him as he leaned over the side, eyes scanning the waves. Minutes passed, then a sudden jolt shook the boat. The net had caught on something heavy. Carlos braced himself and slowly tried to pull it up, but it didn't move easily. At first, he thought it was a large group of fish. That often happened when the net caught too many at once. But the feeling in the rope was different this time. It wasn't moving, it wasn't fighting, it felt still, solid, and strangely heavy. His arms strained as he pulled inch by inch. The boat creaked, tilted slightly to one side under the weight. Carlos paused and looked over the edge. Beneath the surface, through the clear water, he saw something metallic. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a normal object, not a part of a shipwreck or a metal drum. It had corners, perfect corners. It looked like a large, rusted metal box lying half buried in the sand at the bottom. Carlos quickly tied the rope to a hook on the side of his boat to keep it from slipping back down. He grabbed his radio and called his friend Mateo. Mateo was younger and had training in diving. If anyone could help check out this strange find, it was him. About an hour later, Mateo arrived in a small speedboat. He brought his diving gear, and soon he was in the water. Carlos waited nervously above as bubbles rose to the surface. After a few minutes, Mateo came up again, removing his mouthpiece. His face was pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "It's a container," he said, breathing hard. "A big one. Real old, too, but still sealed." Carlos stared at the water, his mind racing. A container? Out here, there were stories of sunken ships and strange things under the sea, but he had never seen one himself. "What do you mean sealed?" Carlos asked. "I mean it hasn't been opened," Mateo said. "It's covered in sea growth, but it looks like no one's touched it in years." Carlos felt a mix of fear and curiosity. He had no idea what was inside. It could be treasure, or garbage, or something dangerous, but he couldn't just leave it down there now. Not after finding it. Mateo dove again, this time with a waterproof flashlight. He examined the sides and found some numbers stamped into the rusted surface. They didn't look like shipping codes. There were no company names, no barcodes, just strange numbers and letters that looked more like military markings. One part had faded red paint, and though it was hard to read, Mateo said it looked like Russian writing. Carlos rubbed his chin. "Russian?" Mateo nodded. "Yeah. Old-style Cyrillic letters, I think. And there's a warning sign near the door." That made Carlos nervous. Why would a Russian container be at the bottom of the ocean near Florida? And more importantly, why was it sealed? They decided not to open it right away. It was too heavy to pull out with their small boats. So they agreed to mark the spot and come back later with better equipment. Carlos placed a bright buoy over the container and saved the location in his GPS. As they returned to shore, neither of them spoke much. They were both thinking the same thing, whatever was in that container. It wasn't meant to be found. That night, Carlos couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at a map of the ocean. His mind was filled with questions. Was it part of an old shipwreck? A secret military mission? He remembered stories from the past, strange objects washing up on the shore, quiet visits from men in suits. But this wasn't a story anymore. It was real, and it was now his problem. Carlos had been a simple man all his life. He lived by the tides, the wind, and the rhythm of the sea. He never wanted trouble, never searched for adventure. But sometimes, the sea doesn't care what you want. Sometimes, it gives you something buried. Something forgotten, and now that he had found it, there was no turning back. He looked out his window, where the sea was dark and endless under the moonlight. Somewhere out there, that container was waiting, and whatever was inside had waited a long time to be seen again. Carlos woke early the next morning, even before the sun had touched the waves. He packed some tools, extra ropes, and a waterproof camera. Mateo arrived not long after, still half asleep but curious and excited. The two men didn't say much as they loaded their gear into the boat. They were thinking about one thing only, the strange container under the sea. The ocean was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But Carlos could feel something different in the air. It wasn't just a normal fishing trip anymore. It felt like they were stepping into something big, something unknown, when they reached the GPS location. Carlos looked around carefully. The bright orange buoy floated in the same spot where he had left it yesterday. They dropped anchor and got to work. Mateo put on his diving gear, checked the oxygen tank, and slipped into the water. Carlos watched the bubbles rise as Mateo swam down. Flashlight in hand down below, the light from the surface faded quickly. Mateo reached the seabed and found the container resting at an angle. It was larger than it had looked yesterday, almost the size of a small truck. Its surface was rough and rusted, covered with seaweed and barnacles. He swam around it slowly, inspecting every side. Then he saw something new, something he had missed the first time. One corner of the container had a small window, made of thick glass. The glass was cloudy, but inside he could see shapes, boxes, and something that looked like equipment. He also found a large metal handle on the front, partly buried in sand. Above the handle was a red label with faded letters. The letters were Cyrillic, just like before Russian writing, but now Mateo could make out a few words: danger and property. He surfaced quickly and climbed back onto the boat, gasping. Carlos helped him up, asking, "Did you see anything?" Mateo nodded and caught his breath. "There's something inside. I saw boxes, gear, maybe machines. And there's a warning sign," he added. "It says danger, and that it's someone's property." Carlos didn't like the sound of that. Property of who? He asked. Mateo shrugged. "Probably Russian military." Carlos frowned, staring out at the waves. What would a Russian military box be doing here, under our water? They both knew it didn't make sense. The Cold War had ended long ago, but during that time, many secrets had been buried. Some said submarines had passed through these waters, maybe even spy missions, but no one had ever proved it until now. Carlos made a decision. "We need to open it." Mateo looked at him, unsure. "It's dangerous," he said. "What if there's something toxic inside?" Carlos replied, "Then we take a look first. No touching, no moving anything." They decided to lift one end of the container, just enough to open the door. They tied strong ropes and used a manual winch from the boat. It took effort, sweat, and careful balancing. But slowly, the container shifted, and the sand around it moved. With a loud metal groan, one corner lifted just enough. Mateo dove down again with a crowbar and small underwater camera. He used the crowbar to unlock the rusted handle. The door didn't swing open, it stuck tight, but after a few strong pulls, it creaked slightly open, enough to let the camera slide through the crack. When he came back up, Carlos connected the camera to a small screen. Both men leaned in, watching closely inside. The flashlight revealed a long, narrow space with metal shelves. On the shelves were boxes, tightly sealed, some covered in strange symbols. There were rolled-up maps in plastic tubes, strange machines with dials, and something that looked like a small control panel with switches. One crate had fallen over and opened slightly, revealing silver cylinders inside. Not food, not weapons, but something unfamiliar. The camera shook a little as it moved, then captured something odd. A photo taped to the wall. It showed men in uniform standing next to what looked like a submarine or some deep-sea device. All of them wore Russian military outfits, and the photo was marked with the year 1962. Carlos sat back slowly, his face pale. "That's Cold War stuff," he whispered. Mateo nodded. "Looks like it. They were no longer just fishermen and divers. They had found something that was never meant to be seen." Carlos thought carefully. Should we call someone? Mateo looked at him. Who? The police? The Coast Guard? What if they just take it and hide it again? Carlos rubbed his face, torn between fear and curiosity. "We should talk to Julia," he said finally. Julia was a reporter and an old friend. She might know what to do, how to keep it safe, and maybe uncover the truth. The men packed up their gear and covered the container again. They didn't want anyone else to find it, not yet. As they headed back to shore, the sky had turned cloudy. Waves rocked the boat harder now. Like the sea was waking up. Carlos felt a deep chill, not from the wind, but from something else. This was no ordinary find. Whatever was in that container had been hidden for decades, and now it was rising again. Carlos sat in his small living room with the curtains drawn shut. The ocean breeze came through the cracks in the window, but he barely noticed it. He was staring at the screen of Mateo's underwater camera. The images played again and again. Old boxes, strange machines, sealed tubes, and that old black and white photo of Russian soldiers from 1962. He couldn't stop thinking about it. What were Russian military items doing at the bottom of American waters? And why was it all still sealed and untouched? Carlos didn't know much about politics or war history, but he knew enough to feel something was wrong. This wasn't just trash from the past. This was part of something bigger, something buried. On purpose, Mateo sat beside him, flipping through one of the photos they printed from the video. "This here," he said, pointing to a tube. "Might be a document container." Carlos leaned in, squinting. It looked like a plastic cylinder with faded tape wrapped around it. There was a stamp on the side, half torn but still visible. Mateo read slowly. He pulled out his phone and translated it. "Project Bright Sky," he said quietly. "That's what it means." Carlos frowned. "Is that the name of the mission?" Mateo nodded. "Maybe. Sounds like a secret project." They both looked at each other. Silence thick in the room. If this was part of a secret Soviet mission, then the box might hold classified military files. Stuff people would kill to keep. Hidden. That's when Carlos made a decision. He picked up his phone and called Julia. Julia was a local reporter. Smart, honest, and not afraid to dig deep. She and Carlos had known each other since they were young. She trusted him, and he trusted her. An hour later, Julia arrived with her camera, notebook, and laptop. She sat down with them and listened. As they explained everything, from the strange tug on the fishing net, to the underwater container, to the Russian writing. She stayed quiet the whole time, eyes wide, fingers tapping her pen. When they finished, she asked only one thing. "Can I see the footage?" Carlos handed her the camera. She watched every second of the video, pausing at the crates, the photo, the sealed tubes. Her face changed as she zoomed in on the photo of the soldiers. "This one here," she said, pointing to the man in the middle. "I've seen him before." She quickly opened her laptop and typed something. Within minutes, she pulled up an old black and white newspaper article. It was from the early 1960s, about a Soviet pilot who had gone missing during a covert mission. The photo matched the man in the container's photo exactly. Same face, same uniform, same cold expression. Carlos leaned back, shocked. So, this man was real? Julia nodded. Not just real, famous in secret circles. She explained that during the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had both sent secret missions into foreign waters, sometimes to spy, sometimes to plant equipment, and sometimes worse. Project Bright Sky, she said, could be one of those missions. She looked up at Carlos. "And you just found evidence of it." Carlos felt a chill go down his spine. He had only wanted to fish, maybe make a good catch that day. But now he was caught in a web of history, politics, and dangerous secrets. Julia asked if she could write about it. Carlos hesitated. He didn't want trouble, not with the government, not with strangers watching him, but he also didn't want To hide something this big, Mateo agreed. We can't bury it again, man. It's already been buried for 60 years, Carlos finally said yes. But they made a plan first. Julia would write a basic article using fake names and not reveal the location of the container. Just enough to get attention, but not enough to cause panic or danger. They uploaded a few photos and a short video clip, blurring faces and removing anything too clear. Within hours, the story started to spread. Local websites picked it up, then national news blogs. People started asking questions. What was Project Bright Sky? Why was a Soviet container in U.S. waters? And who were the men who left it there? Carlos tried not to read the comments online, but curiosity won. Some people called it fake. Others said it was proof of Cold War conspiracies. A few even claimed it was alien-related. Of course, the internet always had wild ideas, but one message stood out. It came through a private email Julia received. No name, no address, only a few words. You've found something dangerous. Do not open it further. People have died for less. That night, Carlos sat by the ocean alone. The stars sparkled above him, and the waves whispered like they always did. But now, the sea felt different. Not peaceful, but quiet in a way that made him feel watched. He looked out at the water, at the spot where the container still rested below. It had waited decades to be found. Now it was speaking again, and someone didn't want that voice heard. Carlos couldn't stop checking his phone. Each time it buzzed, he felt a tight knot in his chest. Ever since Julia's article went online, things had started to change. First came the curious comments, then messages from strangers asking for details. But now the messages were darker warnings, threats, and silent phone calls that ended as soon as he answered. At first, he thought it was a joke. People online like to play games, but that changed. When a call came from a blocked number, Carlos picked up, expecting silence again. Instead, he heard a calm, deep voice say just one thing: "You've made a mistake. Stop now, before you can't." Then the line went dead. Carlos stood frozen in his kitchen, the phone still in his hand. The voice wasn't angry, but it felt serious, dangerous. He looked outside through the curtains, feeling like eyes were watching from the shadows. Later that day, Mateo arrived, holding a USB drive. "I backed up all the footage and files," he said, "just in case." Carlos nodded. "Someone just called me," he said, "told me to stop." Mateo didn't laugh or joke, he believed it. "This is getting serious," he said quietly. "But it's too late to stop now." They met with Julia at a quiet diner outside town. They sat in the back corner, away from windows. She brought a printout of the latest emails she had received. One of them was from a foreign name, no profile picture, no location. The message said, "Container was part of deep sea storage. You must report it to authorities. It is not for civilians." Julia had replied, asking for proof or identity, but got no answer. "I think intelligence agencies know," she whispered. "Maybe both Russian and American." Carlos leaned in, his voice low. "Then why hasn't anyone come to take it?" Julia looked at him, serious. "Maybe they want to see what we do first." The three left the diner separately, careful not to draw attention. Carlos drove home slowly, checking his mirrors often. He didn't notice anyone following, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, just after midnight, he heard a car outside his house. No engine, no movement, just the sound of tires on gravel. He peeked out his window and saw two men standing at the dock, dressed in black. Carlos grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto his porch. "Can I help you?" he called, trying to sound calm. One of the men turned, smiling in a way that didn't feel friendly. "We're with the Coastal Inspection Team," he said, showing a badge too quickly to read. "We heard you might have pulled up something dangerous from the water." Carlos shook his head. "I'm just a fisherman." The man stepped closer. "You sure? No old wrecks? No metal crates?" Carlos crossed his arms. "I fish for snapper, not history." The men stood there for a few more seconds, then nodded. if you do find something unusual. The other one said, we suggest you don't touch it. They walked away, leaving. Carlos standing on the porch with a cold sweat running down his back. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark, holding the USB Mateo had given him. He kept thinking about the container, the old photo, the voice on the phone. Everything pointed to one truth. Someone didn't want the world to know what was down there. The next morning, Carlos went straight to Mateo's place. We need to do something before they come back, he said. Mateo agreed. Let's open one box from inside. Carlos hesitated. What if it's dangerous? Mateo gave a small smile. Then we'll stop. But I have to see it with my own eyes. They waited until the afternoon when the tide was low and fewer boats were out. They took Mateo's diving gear, extra cameras, and a waterproof toolkit. As they reached the spot marked on the GPS, Carlos felt his heart race. The buoy was still there, dancing gently on the waves. The sea looked calm, but something about the silence felt too quiet. Mateo dove down first, this time staying longer. He attached a cable to the corner of the container door and used a portable power tool to slice open the seal. After minutes of careful work, he pulled out a sealed box from inside. He placed it into a floating container and brought it to the surface. Carlos helped him lift it into the boat. It was heavy and cold to the touch. They opened it slowly, carefully. Cutting the locks, inside were metal cylinders with serial numbers. One had a tag written in Russian. Another had warning stripes and the universal sign for radiation. Carlos and Mateo looked at each other, both frozen. This wasn't just history. It was dangerous material, maybe even radioactive. Carlos backed away slowly. We need help. Real help, Mateo nodded. But not the wrong kind. Carlos picked up the satellite phone and made a call, not to the police, but to Julia. She answered immediately. I need you to see something, Carlos said. But don't bring anyone else. The sea, quiet as ever, held its secret no longer, and now, that secret was in their hands, too dangerous to ignore, and too important to keep hidden. Julia arrived at Carlos's dock just before sunset. She wore a black hoodie and sunglasses even though the sun was already going down. She looked around before stepping out of her car, checking if anyone was watching. Carlos waved her over and quickly brought her onto the boat where the sealed metal box waited. Mateo stood nearby, arms crossed, clearly nervous, without a word. Julia leaned over the open crate. Her eyes scanned the metal cylinders inside, her fingers tracing the faded Russian labels. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared at the warning signs, especially the radiation symbol. Then she looked at Carlos and asked softly, Are you sure no one else has touched this? Carlos nodded. Only Mateo. He wore gloves. We didn't open the cylinders, just the box. Julia took photos carefully, making sure the numbers and symbols were clear. Then she pulled out a handheld radiation scanner from her bag, something she had borrowed from a contact at the university. She passed it over the cylinders slowly. The light blinked green. Safe. Carlos exhaled deeply, but Julia didn't look relaxed. If these are real, she said, they could have been part of a Cold War storage unit. Maybe something meant to poison water or disable ships. Mateo raised his eyebrows. Like weapons? Not exactly bombs, Julia said, but dangerous chemicals, maybe radioactive parts of a machine. Something not meant to be left alone. Carlos stepped back and rubbed his face. This isn't just history, he whispered. This is a time bomb. As they talked, a small boat came into view near the edge of the bay. It slowed as it approached. Not coming too close, just enough to be seen. Carlos narrowed his eyes. That's not a fishing boat, he muttered. Mateo looked through binoculars and saw two men inside, both wearing dark clothing and hats pulled low. They didn't wave or speak. After a minute, they turned the boat around and slowly left the area. They're watching, Julia said, her voice cold. They're not here to fish. They want to see what we're doing. Carlos looked around the water, heart pounding. How did they find us? He asked. They probably traced the article or the GPS, Julia replied. Or maybe someone is following me or you. That night, they moved the box from the boat into a hidden shed behind Carlos's house. They covered it with a fishing net, old buckets and boxes, making it look like normal gear. Mateo set up a small motion sensor near the dock, just in case anyone came too close. They all agreed not to return to the container in the water, not. Yet, it was too risky, especially now that people were watching. Instead, Julia focused on the documents, the photos and the labels they had found. She reached out to a trusted historian who specialized in Cold War intelligence. She didn't give full details, just enough to raise curiosity. The next day, things became stranger. Carlos went to the local store for supplies. When he returned, he found his mailbox open and a small envelope inside, no stamp, no address. Inside the envelope was a photo, an old picture of his boat taken from a distance. On the back, one sentence was written, "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Carlos's hands shook as he read it. He showed it to Mateo and Julia, who both agreed this wasn't just a scare tactic anymore. "Someone is close," Julia said. "Maybe even in this town." They made a plan to move everything to a safer place. Mateo had an uncle who owned an old storage unit outside of town, rarely used and far from the coast. They packed the metal box, photos, and documents into a van and drove late at night without headlights through back roads. At the storage unit, they locked everything inside a small room and took turns watching over it. For the next 2 days they waited, unsure what to do next. That's when Julia's historian contact finally called her back. He was shocked by the files she sent and begged to meet in person. He said Project Bright Sky had been whispered about in intelligence circles for decades. It was believed to be a Soviet underwater cache placed in U.S. waters during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The idea was simple: if war broke out, the Soviets could activate it and cause chaos in American sea routes. Carlos couldn't believe it. They really planned to attack from underwater? The historian confirmed, but they never got the chance. Or maybe they never needed to. And that container? It's probably one of the last untouched sites from that plan. Julia ended the call and looked at Carlos. "This is bigger than we thought," she said. Mateo added, "and more dangerous." The group sat in silence, the weight of the truth pressing on them. They had gone from fishermen and divers to keepers of a Cold War secret, a secret someone still wanted hidden, and now that they had uncovered part of it, they were being watched. Carlos looked at the locked door of the storage unit. Behind it was the truth sealed in metal, left behind in the deep. But the deeper truth? Someone, somewhere, wanted it to stay buried. Carlos woke up inside the storage unit, lying on an old camping mattress. The air was cold and smelled of metal and dust. Mateo was still asleep, snoring lightly under a blanket. Julia sat near the door with her laptop on her knees, typing quietly. She had barely slept, trying to organize the information before meeting the historian. Carlos stretched and walked to the corner of the room where the metal box was hidden behind some crates. He stared at it for a long time. It was strange to think such a simple-looking thing could hold so many secrets. It wasn't glowing. It wasn't making sounds. It just sat there silent, waiting, like it had been for 60 years. Later that morning, Julia got a call from the historian. He had arrived in town and wanted to meet in a public place, somewhere safe. Carlos suggested a quiet coffee shop near the highway, far from the coast. The three of them packed their things and left the storage unit. Mateo stayed behind to watch the box, while Carlos and Julia went to the meeting. The historian was a man in his 60s, thin, with white hair and nervous eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Emil Carter. He didn't waste time with small talk. Once they sat down, he pulled out old black and white photos and newspaper clippings from a folder. "These," he said, "are the only known public records of anything related to Bright Sky." He pointed to a blurry photo of a Soviet submarine crew. In the back row was the same officer from the picture found in the container. "That man's name was Anatoly Mirov," Dr. Carter said. a Soviet deep-sea engineer, disappeared in 1962. Carlos leaned in. He's the one in our photo. Dr. Carter nodded. Exactly, and his disappearance was never explained. Julia showed him pictures of the cylinders and the labels. The historian stared at them, shocked. These are not normal weapons, he said. They were experimental containment units meant to release toxic materials slowly underwater, enough to damage ships or sicken anyone who swam near them. Carlos's eyes widened. So it's poison? Not just poison, Dr. Carter said. It was designed for sabotage. Long-term sea denial, Julia asked. Why hide it here, off the coast of Florida? Dr. Carter replied, because this area was one of the key sea routes during the Cold War. The Soviets couldn't risk a direct attack, so they placed these traps. Just in case. Carlos sat back, trying to understand it all. So we found something real and dangerous, the historian nodded, and most likely illegal under international law. They finished their meeting, and Dr. Carter promised to help quietly. He would contact a few trusted people in Washington, not the government directly, but private researchers and archivists who knew how to handle sensitive history. He warned them not to contact the police or military, yet too risky. There was no way to know who was watching or who was involved. Carlos and Julia thanked him and drove back to the storage unit. The sun was already going down when they arrived. But something felt off. The lock on the storage door was broken. Carlos rushed inside, heart racing. Mateo was gone. So was the metal box. The entire place had been searched, gear thrown around, blankets torn, papers missing. Julia gasped. They found it. Carlos stood frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. He called Mateo's phone. It rang, but no answer. Then, a few minutes later, Julia's phone rang. It was Mateo, and his voice was shaky. I'm okay, he said quietly. I'm at my uncle's house. I left to get more food and water. Carlos sighed with relief. Thank God. But the box is gone, Mateo cursed under his breath. They must have come while I was out. I didn't think they'd move so fast. Carlos looked around the room. No signs. No names, no clues, just silence, just emptiness. He clenched his fists, angry and afraid. We can't let them disappear this, he said. We need to finish the story, get the truth out now, before it's all gone. That night, Julia uploaded everything she had, photos, documents, videos, everything except the exact location. She wrote a long article with the title, Cold War Secret Found in U.S. Waters, then vanished. It spread fast, even faster than the first story. Soon it was on news channels, blogs, and even international papers. People started asking real questions. Some said it was fake. Others said it was covered up by governments. But most people believed something had been hidden, something dark. Something the world had a right to know. Carlos didn't care about fame. He just wanted the truth to come out, even without the container. The story had become too big to bury again. The ocean had given up its secret, but someone had taken it back. Now the only way to fight back was with the truth, and Carlos was ready. The sun was rising slowly, but Carlos didn't feel the warmth. He sat on the dock outside his house, staring at the quiet sea. He felt tired, not just in his body, but deep in his soul. The metal box was gone, taken by people who wanted it hidden. But something inside him refused to give up. Julia joined him with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and sat beside him without speaking. They both looked out at the waves, lost in thought. The world now knew something had been found, something strange and buried under the sea for decades. But without the container, proof was slipping away. Then Julia's phone buzzed. It was an email from someone she didn't know. The message said, "Meet me at the old shipyard. Midnight. Come alone." I know what they took. Carlos looked at the message and frowned. It could be a trap, he said. Julia nodded. Or maybe it's someone who's tired of hiding secrets. That night, Julia went to the shipyard with a small hidden camera. In her coat, Carlos and Mateo waited nearby in a van, watching from a distance. The area was quiet, empty. And covered in shadows, old broken boats lay forgotten along the shore. Julia walked carefully, her eyes scanning every corner. Then, from behind a pile of rusty chains, a man stepped out. He wore a dark coat and a cap pulled low. His face was mostly hidden, but his voice was steady. "You don't know me, but I worked for them." "The ones who took the box," he said. Julia didn't speak, just listened. The man continued. "You were right. It's not just history, it's a weapon. An experiment they never wanted the world to know." He handed her a small drive. "This has documents, photos, internal reports," he said. "Proof that the container was part of Bright Sky and that it was placed here on purpose." "Decades ago," Julia asked, "why are you giving this to me?" The man's voice cracked slightly. "Because I watched them bury the truth for too long. And I can't live with it anymore." Then he turned and disappeared into the shadows. Julia rushed back to the van, her hands shaking. Carlos and Mateo opened the door, and she jumped inside. She plugged the drive into her laptop, and the files began to load. Dozens of documents appeared, some in Russian, some in English. Scanned maps showed drop points, old satellite photos, and memos marked top secret. There were details about testing chemicals underwater, photos of Soviet submarines placing containers during the 1960s, and finally, a report dated 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed. The report said, "Operation Bright Sky concluded. All units lost or unaccounted for. Do not recover." Carlos leaned forward, reading each line slowly. "They never meant to retrieve it," he whispered. "They just left it there, hoping no one would ever find it," Mateo added. "But we did, and now it's out in the world again." Julia didn't waste time. She wrote a new article with the headline, "Secret Operation Confirmed. Cold War Weapon." Hidden in U.S. waters, she included the new documents. Redacted names for safety, but kept the evidence strong. The story exploded across the internet, reaching news networks and foreign media within hours. This time, the response was different. Politicians began asking questions in public. The Coast Guard issued a statement denying knowledge of the operation. Russia said nothing at all, but independent researchers confirmed the documents looked real. One retired naval officer even admitted on live television that there were whispers of things left behind, traps set for a war that never came. Carlos felt strange watching the news. His quiet life had changed forever. He never asked to be part of a secret from history. He only wanted to fish, to live in peace. But fate had chosen him to bring the truth to light. One morning, as he walked to the dock, he saw something strange. A small package sat at the end of the pier, wrapped in plastic. He looked around. No one was in sight. Inside the package was a photo, the same black and white picture of the Soviet engineer, but this time, the man's face was crossed out with red ink. Beneath it was a note, "Stop digging. Last warning." Carlos stood there for a long time, holding the photo. His hands were steady, but his heart was pounding. He knew what it meant. Someone still wanted silence, but he also knew there was no going back. He burned the photo that night, not out of fear, but to show he wasn't afraid. He looked at Mateo and Julia and said, "We finish this. We tell everything. No more secrets." And they agreed. No matter who came for them next, they had the truth. And now the world did too. Carlos stood on the same dock where everything had begun. The sky was soft with morning light, the waves calm, as if the sea had forgotten the secrets it once held. But Carlos hadn't forgotten, and he never would. The journey that started with a strange tug on his fishing net had become something far bigger than he ever imagined. People all over the world now knew about Project Bright Sky. News stations were still talking about it weeks later. Experts from universities and old military officials came forward, confirming the documents and photos were real. Some said the project had been buried by both American and Russian governments after the Cold War. Too risky, too shameful, and too dangerous to speak about again. But thanks to Carlos, Julia, and Mateo, the truth was out. The stolen container was never found again. It vanished completely. No one claimed responsibility. No one gave answers. But with the files from the mystery man at the shipyard, they had enough to tell the full story. Julia's articles were read by millions. She was invited to give interviews and even appeared on global news. But she always mentioned Carlos and Mateo. She said, without them, the ocean would still be hiding history. Carlos didn't like the attention. He avoided the cameras and interviews. He returned to his small fishing life. But everything felt different now. Sometimes he would look out at the sea and wonder how many more secrets still slept beneath the waves. What else was buried in the deep, waiting to be found? Mateo used his diving experience to start offering safe ocean tours to schools and science groups. He called it the Hidden Sea Project. He taught young people how to respect the ocean and how to ask questions when something doesn't feel right. He never told them the full story, but he always said, truth rises like air bubbles. Slowly, but always to the surface. One afternoon, Carlos received a letter. It had no return address. Just his name handwritten on the envelope. Inside was a short message. We watched you. We warned you. But the world chose noise over silence. Be safe. Be quiet now. There are more boxes than you think. Carlos read the message twice, then burned it in the fire pit outside his house. He didn't feel fear this time. He felt power. Because they had tried to scare him into silence, but now the whole world was listening. It was too late for them to hide again. A month later, a group of international scientists arrived in Florida. They wanted to search the nearby waters for other possible containers. Julia helped coordinate the team, and Carlos allowed them to use his original GPS location. The search was slow, and results were unclear. Some thought they found pieces of old wrecks. Others believed more sealed boxes might be deeper under the sand. But nothing was confirmed. At least not yet. Still, people kept asking questions. Why weren't these boxes reported after the Cold War? Who knew about them? And most importantly, how many were left out there? Carlos didn't have all the answers. He only knew one thing. The ocean didn't keep secrets forever. And even if men tried to bury the truth, it would rise again, just like it did that day with his fishing net. Julia later wrote a book called Buried in the Blue. It became a bestseller, and she gave all the profits to ocean cleanup and marine education. Carlos refused to take any money. He said, "The sea gave me a story. That's enough for one life." One quiet evening, as Carlos fixed his fishing lines under the orange sky, Mateo walked over holding an old photo. It was the black and white picture of the Soviet team, the one found in the container. But something had been added on the back. Someone had drawn a small map with red circles along the coastline. Mateo looked at Carlos and said, "This wasn't in the digital files. I think we missed something." Carlos took the photo and studied the red circles. Each one marked a spot along the sea places no one had searched yet. He didn't speak for a moment, then finally said, "Maybe we're not done after all." Mateo smiled. "One last dive?" Carlos nodded slowly, "Just one. For the truth." And so once again, they prepared the boat. The sea was waiting, still holding pieces of a forgotten war, still whispering its long-held secrets to those willing to listen. Carlos looked at the horizon, the soft wind brushing his face. The truth had found him once. Maybe it was calling him again, and this time he was ready.